we all go through ups and downs in the spiritual life. Some days it's really easy to pray, it's really easy to follow God. Other days, life feels like a drudgery, and God feels far away from us. There's no shame in experiencing that. The back and forth, though, between being excited about our faith and the discouragement can be confusing for us at times. We often experience these fluctuations, the highs and the lows, without really understanding or knowing how to approach them. What's coming from God, what's not coming from God. So is there anything that can help us sort through those experiences in the spiritual life? Well, yes, there is. It's to be found in the Rules for the Discernment of Spirits, as taught by St. Ignatius of Loyola. The rules of St. Ignatius give us practical wisdom for how to notice, name, and receive God's loving action during our day. Well, we'll find in the future he calls them consolations. They also teach us to notice, to name, and reject the obstacles of spiritual desolation. That's what they're called, when we grow disheartened or discouraged or weary. So I myself was first introduced to the Rules for the Discernment of Spirits when I was in the seminary. So during my summer where I was with the Institute for the Priestly Formation in Omaha, I really grew in my understanding of prayer like I never knew you could before. And among our instructors was Father Timothy Gallagher, whose extensive background in spiritual teaching of St. Ignatius greatly has influenced me and the way that I teach the discernment of spirits. So if you want more information, greater in-depth discussion, Father Gallagher's resources are so much better than mine. But he's not here, I'm here, so you get me. But I put some of those at the end of your handout if you want to check out. He's got an audio series, Setting the Captives Free, a book, Discernment of Spirits, Ignatian Guide for Everyday Living. So that's some of his resources. But you can find all sorts of resources on his website or on where you find that Setting Captives Free series. So to draw an image that goes back to the Middle Ages, I'm only able to share all these insights of the spiritual life with you, having climbed up on the shoulders of giants like Father Gallagher and St. Ignatius. So, but somebody, in hearing this, I did have somebody come up to me and be like, "More rules, Father? Isn't it just like the church? Just add a bunch of more rules? Don't we have enough with the Ten Commandments and the precepts of the church and canon law? Do we really need more rules for us to follow?" And that's an unfortunate misunderstanding because, none of the church's rules are arbitrarily, imposed upon us. And even less so are these rules for the discernment of spirit. So they're not really so much rules that you have to follow as these unchanging, trustworthy principles for understanding how to navigate those ups and downs of the spiritual life. Especially when so many other things in our life are uncertain, we need some certainty, right? So these rules help us recognize in the midst of all the various thoughts, the emotions, the desires that are ever changing within us, what's coming from God? Where do we recognize His voice? And what are things that are coming from the enemy? So these are not so much rules that everybody has to follow, but if you want to better recognize God's voice and overcome discouragement in the spiritual life, then I invite you to learn and remember and apply these rules, these principles in your discernment. So before I begin talking about discernment itself, I want to give an example to illustrate this from the life of St. Ignatius himself. He was a young soldier, and he was more interested in worldly things. He had dreams of romance and chivalry. He was in battle where he suffered an injury, and he found himself in bed recovering. And so there in bed, you can imagine, as he's waiting to heal, he's spending hours daydreaming about all the heroic acts he would go back to do in knighthood and how he'd win the heart of a lady. But he also, because they didn't have anything else to read, he started reading the life of Christ and of the saints. And finally, a day of grace came when St. Ignatius says, his eyes were opened a little. He notices that when he's been thinking about all the chivalry and romance, his heart is engaged and excited about all of that. But then when he goes off to other things, he finds his heart is dry and discontent and unfulfilled. But then he noticed that when he's been thinking about following Jesus or imitating the saints, his heart is once again uplifted while he's doing that. But then when he goes on to other things, his heart remains happy and consoled and content. And so he begins to ponder, why is this? What does this mean? And he realizes that the thoughts that leave his heart empty are not from God. And the thoughts that leave his heart full of joy are where God is trying to lead him in his life. And so he takes action. He makes a life-changing confession. He goes back to Mass and prayer. He begins performing acts of service for the poor, and a life of holiness begins. So we can ask, what if that day St. Ignatius' eyes had not been opened? What if he hadn't paid attention to what was going on within him interiorly? Well, his life may not have changed. He might not have become a saint. What about all those many Jesuit saints that came after him when he founded the Society of Jesus? Would they have existed? Think of the ripple effects of when one man began to notice what was going on in his heart, when he began to discern God's voice. So let's apply that to ourselves. What will happen in our lives if we live with our spiritual eyes open, even just a little, to begin to be aware of the interior experiences within our thoughts and in our hearts, to begin to reflect and name what's from God and accept those things, and what's not from God and should be set aside. It could mark a whole new beginning of our spiritual journey of transformation, of growth and renewal. And so that's why I go back to these rules for the discernment of spirits so often when I'm asked for spiritual advice. They've helped me immensely in my life, and I know that they can help you as well. So what is this discernment, if we gave it a definition? Well, discernment, you might often hear it, in Catholic circles, as used to talk about young people trying to figure out what their vocation is, discerning priesthood or religious life. And that's true, but discernment doesn't necessarily have to be that specific. Discernment of spirits is about understanding what's going on in the interior life, including all of our thoughts, feelings, desires, being able to notice what those are, name where they're coming from, and then either accept or reject them depending upon where they come from. So that means there's 3 steps to discernment, and I have those listed on your handout so you can remember them. The first thing is that we first notice. We become aware of what's going on within our thoughts, feelings, and desires. The second thing, we name, we understand where they're coming from. They can have one of 3 sources. They can either just come from ourselves, they can come from God, or they could come from the enemy. And then third, we act. We act by rejecting what's bad, and we accept the good. So let's look a little bit at each of those parts. So the first thing in discernment is to notice. To notice or become aware of the thoughts, feelings, desires, the things going on within. And you may, if you recall, the 4 habits of relational prayer, ARRR, this actually overlaps with that very first habit of acknowledge, right? We're just becoming aware of the movements within our mind and heart without, at that point, yet evaluating them. We're just being honest about, this is actually what I'm thinking, this is actually what I'm feeling, whether, and not just reject them outright as to, where do they come from yet, right? First, we want to notice what they are. Because then the next step, that's when we'll seek to name the source of those movements, to discern between true and false beliefs and between good and bad desires. So that leads us to the second one, which is to name the source. So the second step of discernment is to understand where those interior movements are coming from. As I mentioned earlier, they can come from ourselves, they can come from God, they can come from the enemy. So, ourself. Many of the thoughts, feelings, desires we have are just simply our own. They're not necessarily have anything to do with our relationship with God. So they might be on the kind of surface level or even a psychological kind of habitual level within our life, but not necessarily in the level of our relationship with God. So it could just be coming from ourself. Thoughts like, what am I going to have for lunch? You don't necessarily have to spend lots of time discerning what's God's will for you there. It's not necessarily about your relationship with maybe, but usually probably not. Other times we do need to sort through our own ideas because sometimes we can get in our mind that our ideas are really, really good and therefore they must be God's ideas too. But are they really? Are they just our own? So it could be just ourselves. But on the level of our relationship with God, it could be from him. Could be what St. Ignatius will refer to as the good spirit, right? So the good spirit, is God who can reveal himself through our interior experiences, including the thoughts, the desires that are going on within. And this is this good spirit, who could be God or Jesus or the Holy Spirit, can include the good angels and their guidance for us, the intercession of the saints, the power of grace that we have from our baptisms, and all those positive influences around us too. So God can even speak through what other people and how we may interact with them as well. We can be able to recognize his voice sometimes through that. So we have God on one hand, but then on the other end, we also have the bad spirit. We need to discern when certain thoughts, desires, feelings have their origin from the enemy, or the bad spirit, as Ignatius will call him. And so the enemy is, of course, first Satan, the tempter, but it's also the other fallen angels, whose only goal is to try to destroy us. Of course, when we're recognizing the enemy, it doesn't mean that, oh, that's the voice of the enemy, I must be possessed. No, that's not what we're talking about here. The influences that will originate in the enemy, temptations, lies that come up, they have the origin in the father of lies. So the bad spirit includes all the harmful influences in the world around us. As the world, the flesh, the devil. We have temptations that draw us away from God. And so discernment, the process of discernment, is really between those two spirits, the good spirit and the bad spirit. And that's what all the rules of St. Ignatius are all about. He has 14 of them, so we're not even going to start going through them tonight. We're just introducing you to them tonight. So what is coming from God, and to accept them, and what's coming from the enemy and reject those. And that leads us to the last part. That last step of discernment is to act. So now St. Ignatius describes the rules this way. He says, therefore, perceiving and knowing in some manner the different movements which are caused in the soul, the good to receive them, the bad to reject them. So discernment is directed toward action. It's directed toward action. It's not just enough for us to see and understand what's happening in our life. We also need to then choose what's good and reject what is evil. Some moments it's really easy to tell this is obviously good and this is obviously evil. We don't really need to do a whole lot of, discerning between them. It's when it's more difficult to figure out what exactly is God's will. That's where these rules of discernment help us to do that. So once we recognize the source of that specific thought or desire, then we act by accepting what's coming from God and rejecting what's not. So we're rejecting the discouraging lies of the enemy. But we don't want to let him and those lies and those ideas stop us from moving along the journey of growth. Instead, we want to accept the things that come from God that's going to encourage us to continue in that way. So that's all I wanted to really cover tonight. Hopefully you can begin to see how this is going to be very practical, I think, for discernment. It's a practice in prayer, of course, being able to recognize God's voice in the midst of things going on, whether it's happening in your prayer specifically or happening in all the other things going on around you the rest of your day, so that we can understand his guidance and his will. So in the next Sunday Sparks that we'll have in a couple weeks, we're going to begin by looking at the first two rules of St. Ignatius's discernment. So I encourage you to come back for that, invite other people that you think might find it helpful, so that we can better be able to recognize God's voice.